Okay, we're live. So I guess I ought to just do introductions. As you can tell by the title, the debate is between Trini and Arodaro, and the topic that they will be debating is over the likelihood of God's existence. Now, Aro will be defending that the likelihood of his existence is greater, therefore making the notion that he does not exist fallacious. Whereas Trini will be debating the contrary, essentially saying that a belief in God is not justifiable. So that's more or less what the topic is going to be. Now, rules for the debate are pretty simple. Well, for one, we have a no insulting rule. You're not allowed to insult or make sly comments or even direct attacks on a person rather than their arguments. Doing so will result in disqualification based on who starts insulting first. So if somebody retaliates, the blame will still fall on the person who started the conflict, right? There will be a 6-minute period where each person can speak while the other cannot. Each person does not have to use this time period if they do not like to. They can stop if they want to. And 6 minutes, the final 6 minutes of the stream will be used as closing arguments. And the stream, in theory, will last 1 hour, though knowing these niggas, you already know that might not be the case. So,
I feel deeply insulted.
He's not wrong.
Same. But yeah. Okay. So anything else to establish, or are we going?
Yeah, intervals of 6 minutes.
Hey.
Yeah, intervals of 6 minutes. So also my nigga Coke is here. Yeah.
Hi. I'm Risky. And I'm gonna go take a shower really quick.
Oh, this.
Be right back.
Oh, this dude. Anyway, I guess we ought to just start then. Like I said, intervals of 6 minutes. So before
we do that, is it okay? I forgot if I can ask this. I'm gonna have like a really quick discussion with Ara. Ara, just making clear, what is your position?
What is my position?
Uh-huh.
That the likeliness of God existing is greater than the likeliness of him not. And that believing that he doesn't exist, so attempting to prove that God does not exist in itself is fallacious. Not because it's not because it's necessarily proving a negative, but more so because the existence of God is basically undeniable.
Okay, you think that the existence of God is undeniable?
Yeah, but only in correlation with the idea that he isn't. It's only like that. So basically, I personally don't think that it's undeniable. But if you're going to claim that if you're going to claim that God doesn't exist, then the direct oppositionary claim would be that he does. You know what I mean?
Okay, I got you. I just want to say that I just would say that there's not a single compelling argument in favor of God's existence. That is not to say he doesn't exist. It's more so to say that there's no evidence or argument that you could make to rationalize his existence or prove his existence. Consequently, it's just not logical to believe in. He could exist. That's definitely a possibility. But the likelihood of that is kind of something you can't really speak on. There's just no good reason to believe in it.
Okay, so I guess we can start on intervals. Oh, sorry.
Yeah. Oro, is this a dialogue, discussion, or debate?
Is this a debate? Is that what you're asking?
Yeah, is this a dialogue, discussion, or debate?
This is a debate. That's been established.
Okay, can someone define that, just so everyone's clear?
Define debate?
Yeah, so it's clear.
Will be fine.
You want the definition of a debate? A formal discussion?
Good.
Generally on a topic?
Yeah, that's fine. Argument? Yeah, he's going to get the Oxford Dictionary.
Okay. Oxford debate in Oxford. Now, I guess that one lines up. A formal discussion on a particular matter in a public meeting, which this is a public meeting, or legislative assembly, which this isn't, but it doesn't need to be, right? In which opposing arguments are put forward, and it usually ends on a vote, but that's with more formal debates that are like with politicians. Again, this is just a Hangouts debate, so certain requirements like that aren't really going to be a part of this. It's just you put arguments forward and you expect refutations for those arguments in a formal setting, that's what this is. So
okay. Another thing I think is just worth getting into, definitely, is the definition of God. Just to be a little autistic here. How would you define God, Ara?
How would I define God? Abraham defined God then.
I mean, like, she's Oxford.
Yeah, he's Oxford.
Okay. Well, a god will be, you know, well, according to Oxford, it says in Christianity and other monotheistic religions, the creator and ruler of the universe and the source of all moral authority, the supreme being.
Okay. So I just want to say that I subscribe to a Spinozan updog interpretation of God. And so I get where you guys are coming from, but I just think like, God is this Spinozan updog interpretation, which is to say that he's, omnipotent, but he only acts within his nature.
Oh, wait, he
Okay.
only acts within his what? Sorry, I didn't get that last part.
So basically, the Spinozan updog interpretation is that, God is able to do anything so long as it does not contradict his nature.
Okay. And what do you believe God's nature is?
That's up for debate, depending on who you ask. But for me, I would say that God should be something benevolent, and just in terms of most modern religions. And
Okay.
that's what I was asking with Ara. Like, do you agree with that Spinozan updog interpretation, or?
Well, that in itself is kind of contradictory as well. You can't be omnipotent but only work within your own limitations. You would have to be able to work. Period.
Yeah,
Or
but
work not at
it's
all.
the Spinozan updog interpretation.
Okay.
And are you okay with that, or?
It doesn't change what I said though.
Okay.
So is it it's just an interpretation, right? And you're asking me if I agree with that interpretation.
Do you see any flaws with that definition, like the Spinozan updog interpretation?
Yeah, the flaw I just named. The fact that you can't necessarily have somebody be omnipotent, but have any sort of restriction set. It doesn't work like that.
Well, it's not a restriction. It's his nature.
Yeah, but that in itself would be a restriction because an omnipotent being shouldn't be capable of things like that.
Wait, so are we getting into the
feeling.
actual? Wait, is this getting into the actual debate or what?
No.
So this is just framework. That way, when because you have to establish these things, and then the debate will be fine, I think. So what would you suggest instead of the Spinozan updog interpretation?
The definition Abraham gave was fine. The supreme being, ruler of the universe, monotheistic person of worship. Well, I say person, but monotheistic being of worship.
Okay, so philosophically speaking, I mean, how do you reconcile with such a being contradictory to just pure logic?
How do I reconcile with him being contradictory? What are you asking?
How do you reconcile with an omnipotent being contradicting logic?
How does the omnipotent being contradict logic?
Have you heard of the omnipotence paradox?
I've heard of a lot of paradoxes in regards to omnipotence because omnipotence in itself is a paradox. Which
okay, yeah. So, more specifically, being able to lift up a rock that or being able to create a rock that God cannot lift. That creates a paradox. But the only way you could reconcile that is to say God does not abide by logic. In which case, any further discussion would thereby, you trying to logically substantiate God would just not work. Because he's not a being that you could even apply logic to. Do you get where I'm coming from? That's why I use the Spinozan updog interpretation. Yeah.
It's not a being you can apply logic to, but if you're going to classify him as omnipotent, then omnipotency, just the idea of being an omnipotent being allows you to bypass all of that. It isn't that he's necessarily contradictory, it's that he bypasses the concept of being contradictory. There would be no concepts, period. That's what an omnipotent being is.
That's kind of like the Spinozan updog interpretation.
Okay. So I mean,
minus the nature. Okay, yeah, okay. We can get into it now. That's fine.
Okay. So wait, yeah, we agreed that Trini would be going first. Is that still an agreement or what?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay. Well, you can go first, kind of present your argument, I guess, so you're open.
So I just want to reiterate my position is that I am not here to disprove God. That is in no way what I'm trying to do. My position is that you could not justify a belief in God. And this is primarily because, again, as the framework was discussed, you are not able to apply logic to him. There's nothing we could potentially do that would be able to even fathom, let alone measure and prove that there is such a being. So if you were to say, what if God comes down and speaks to us? How would you know it's God? You wouldn't be able to. They could be infinitely above our comprehension, but that does not preclude the fact, not the fact, but the possibility. The possibility that they could have been created by something far greater, something beyond even their imagination. And again, if you want to subscribe to the idea that the universe doesn't work as an independent model, right? If you want to disagree with how the universe came into being, you want to say that it was created by some sort of omnipotent being, that wouldn't really work. Not if you're going to posit that the suggestion of a god would make more sense. And the reason that wouldn't make any sense, I would imagine, is because when you say that, you have to presuppose that there's this deity. There's this deity that is capable of creating just about anything. A universe in this case. Oh my God, who's messaging me? And you have to presuppose that this being is not only logical, which again doesn't make sense within the confines of what logic is, but it's just not something tenable. It's not any more sensible than saying that the universe was created as an independent thing. It was done independently of any outside entity, and we have evidence substantiating that. That is the scientific consensus. And science has been what is philosophically prevailed. Not to make an appeal to authority, but it is very popular among philosophers in a lot of ways. And you have natural philosophers who eventually led to the conclusion that science was, kind of its own brand of working philosophy, an applicable philosophy. And so that's why science is treated differently from philosophy, because it became its own separate entity. And again, the scientific consensus is that we are here as a result of the universe coming into existence, by itself. It came here independently. And so if you want to go in and say that God exists, you'd have to prove that. It's such an extraordinary claim that the burden of proof that you'd have to substantiate would be just completely dismal. I don't know how you would even begin to prove it. You can't use common sense arguments. Again, God's beyond our logic, beyond our sense, beyond any common sense. And so could you even really provide evidence? I don't think you could. And here's the other thing. I don't even think there is evidence. I do not see any real evidence. And so Hitchens' razor, that which can be asserted without evidence can be dismissed without evidence.
Okay.
Which is basically that.
Okay, so are you finished?
Yeah.
Okay. So because I
Yeah,
was kind
go
of
ahead.
going on. So I don't think that was actually 6 minutes, but yeah.
It's fine.
Anyway, yeah.
I'll start timing myself. Yeah.
No, I can do it. I just kind of fucked up there. So, Aro, you can go ahead now. And
Okay.
honestly, I would recommend both of you be writing down what the other is saying in case you get lost. So
Okay. Yeah.
you don't have to, but I'm just saying. All right, go ahead.
Sure. Number one, concluding that said being is not God due to having a creator assumes that the being has a creator. Now, I'm saying that in retaliation to where you said a human or whatever being comes down and claims to be God. Now, the issue with that is that you're assuming that being has a creator. You're assuming that. The assumption that the being has a creator is actually it's actually the presumption that the being isn't God right off the bat, and that in itself is negative. That in itself is honestly malicious in the idea that not believing in God is just kind of the idea set there. Now, the other thing is the idea of there being a God does make sense because in the case of there being a God, the fact of the matter is that God being likely is the only likelihood. Pardon me, God being likely is the superior likelihood because there's no physical way the universe could have been created otherwise. If we look at the actual universal conception and if we look at actual calculations made on how this physically works, we have the Stephen Unwin calculation. If you're aware of that, the Stephen Unwin calculation is by Stephen Unwin, a physicist who created a calculation of God existing found on patheos.com. I can link it to you if you'd like. Now, whether or not you buy the calculation doesn't actually affect me, but the calculation itself is a legitimate consensus gathered by a quote scientist gathered from his own data. Now, I can implement a form of Rogerian argument and give you the possible counterclaim that his calculation has been built on the components of what he dictates to be relevant for the calculation. So his components of the calculation are morally based, meaning he has things specifically kind of weighed out on the table. So I don't think that, generally speaking, the average person would have differing morals to that extent. The calculation would still be accurate. but it might be different in like other countries where I would say the kind of religious just sphere in general is probably more minimalistic. The other thing is that again, in this case, I'm not claiming morals are subjective, but in this case, whether or not you have the components the same as he would is morally subjective, just in that case. But however, high or low you place murder on the social pedestal of deviance and crimes is up to you. Murder is the most, I would say, one of the most negative things a human could do, and that doesn't inherently make it right. But the point I was getting to is that the calculation itself, regardless of where you place your morals as a human being, would still have a higher possibility of God existing. Now, the possibility is actually 67%, so 0.67 is a decimal. I know I just said a fucking mouthful. I apologize if it sounded like I was gish galloping. I had to refute a lot there too. But my point is that Stephen Unwin created a calculation. The calculation went into depth with a lot of things in regard to how morals, humanity, and the origin of the universe works, and came to the conclusion that there is a 67% chance that God exists. And if your morals differ, that percentage is still evidently there. Now, I'm not arguing that God does exist fully, because I do believe that, but I'm not necessarily arguing that at this time, but rather that it makes more sense for a God to exist than no God at all, because to argue that no God exists equates to the argument that everything formed from nothing, and to believe that everything formed from nothing is physically impossible, whereas supernatural beings controlling, or a supernatural being, controlling the universe, or having tampered with or created it, simply makes more sense. I said controlling, but I specifically meant creating. So, like a supernatural being creating the universe, and according to also the Unwin calculations that I provided, would make more sense. The other thing you mentioned is that science has, philosophically prevailed over the numerous, yada yada yada. The point is that science has philosophically prevailed, and that's fine, but it hasn't philosophically prevailed over the numerous monotheistic worshippers worldwide, and there are religious scientists too. And Unwin would be classified as a scientist. So even if it has prevailed, not all of the overall relevance found in that argument would be relative to what's actually going on with other scientists do not. It's not a general consensus. It might be a consensus for a particular group, or maybe for the majority, but not for. There's always going to be a minority. Is what I'm trying to say. The scientific consensus is the idea that everything formed from nothing. So Richard Dawkins' logic, yeah, that's just not how things work. Because again, it almost kind of goes into what you said earlier about God not going into kind of logic. So God's existence not really containing logic, and that's fine, because if we argue that God doesn't have any sort of just the existence of God doesn't have any sort of logic, period, that would actually add on to what I'm saying, because the conservation of matter and energy is entirely discarded if you argue that Richard Dawkins, or just the idea that everything formed from nothing, is correct. I have more to say, but I'm just going to stop it right there because I feel like what I just said is a complete mouthful. So I'll just stop it right there. But I hope you understood what I said. All right.
Okay, so would you mind linking me the calculation?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I couldn't actually find the actual calculation itself was on I believe it was in his 2004 book, but I do have a website that lists the calculation, so I'll give you that.
Okay. Yeah,
It's
that's completely fine. Please.
Yeah, it's from pathos.com. Here you go.
All right. That doesn't use up your turn, by the way, unless you want him to elaborate, then it would.
He left.
Also,
W for me.
oh, yeah.
The king is back.
All right. Return when you actually start your argument, so I can start this stopwatch or whatever. So.
Who, me?
Okay.
Or...
Yeah.
I'll just mute myself now. That's the questions.
All right.
Okay. Yeah, I'm just looking through for a moment.
Shit. All right.
You just unmuted yourself and laughed, Abraham.
I was laughing. I was nigga.
You deserve to get demoted from Battle Kingdom.
Yeah. I'm sorry. I'm getting demoted from Battle Kingdom. I'm gonna write a fucking long Bible. All that shit. But no, I was laughing at something I was reading. So yeah, sorry.
No, I'm fine. Hold on. Okay. Yeah, because I want to methodologically debunk this, but I gotta.
And you could just
not too.
I read the argument too, like the article a while ago. So it's I don't think it's that long. So, if I recall.
Okay.
And by the way, if there are specific points you want me to go to, I can show them on the screen for the viewer.
Oh no. Yeah. Okay.
Just off topic, but by the way, I just to mention, I did say that like it is kind of morally dependent on whether or not you buy what he says. Like, you know what I mean? So it is dependent on what you personally believe, because you might have like the deviant or kind of I guess socially different person that'll just kind of not buy into it because they'll like have completely different beliefs. So if you don't end up buying into it, that's fine.
Yeah. Wait. Okay, I keep fucking going on Discord. That was my issue for a moment there. I was like trying to get back into the call. Okay, so it's morally dependent?
Yeah.
Okay, I think that itself poses an issue, don't you think?
Okay. That itself poses an issue? Oh, well, it's an issue that I believe I've already went over.
How so? Just elaborating here before I get to my arguments.
Okay. An issue that I went over in that essentially the moral argument here would be only in the case where somebody's morals entirely differ. If your morals differ to the extent where if you think murder is okay in any context, like that's insanely different from what the average person would believe. It's insanely deviant. So only in that case would the calculation actually differ by a significant margin. It's still 67%. It's still in that 60% range. So the likelihood of God existing is still above.
Okay, and do you know what the scientific consensus is on this? Because I think that's really Do you know what the consensus is?
The consensus is essentially the Richard Dawkins argument. It's just a general way to debunk it because it's morally dependent and not everybody has the same morals. So I did implement Rogerian argument earlier by telling you essentially what the counterclaim was, but just that it doesn't really work.
Yeah, okay, so here's my issue with it. The fact that it's morally dependent is an issue. That creates a really, really big issue. And you can't calculate the likelihood of something that is just beyond logic. That wouldn't make any sense. Something that is infinite is not even something that we can calculate, like in any other context. It's literally just a concept. We wouldn't be able to. If you want to respond to that, you can. I'm about to get into the rest of the argument, though.
Sure. It's not necessarily the likeness. It's not necessarily God himself that's the concept that's impossible to calculate here. I would understand that if that was if that was the case here, I would actually understand that. But the issue is what he's basically calculating here is simply the likelihood of whether or not God exists in correlation with evidence that goes otherwise. So he's weighing the two. He's weighing the two, and that's one of the conclusions he came to, and the calculation helps that and boosts that. Like the person themselves is basically, as far as I'm aware about Stephen Unwin, his book is basically in regard to him being a physicist, but somebody that believes in God. And he's, quote, proven that. Not necessarily proven that God again exists, but that there is a very, very big chance that he does. Richard, again, I think he believes in God. If he doesn't, then that just, it shows a lack of bias too. In his own beliefs towards the whole case. Yeah, you can go.
Okay, so I can't find anything. It seems as though this was not published work. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and start my argument if you want to time it, Abraham. Are you timing it? Or?
Oh, just give me a moment.
Okay. I was like, hello?
Yeah, I was in a different app, so I could not mute myself immediately. Yes, go.
Okay. I just wanted to respond to something. I think I may have miscommunicated here, or at least have been misunderstood. I definitely did not say that something coming down to claim it was God would for sure have a creator. I said the fact that would be a possibility. Something that's insurmountably above us could potentially have something insurmountably above it. Kind of creates an issue. You would have an issue in that because you can't prove that the being coming down, which is like pretty much the only way you could try and argue that for sure that there is a God. You could not even really say that is justifiable, because you still run into the issue of, well, who's to say that one doesn't have a creator? And as far as the universal model of it just being independent, like it does work. I understand where you're coming from with the calculation, but here's an issue with it. You mentioned that it's morally predicated, but here we'll even dismiss that, and we're gonna just look at two different things. One big thing to keep in mind is that you are trying to figure out how likely like a being beyond logic is. That doesn't make any sense. If it's something beyond logic, which is the only way you could reconcile the omnipotence paradox, um, the only way you could really say that like, we would measure it is to then thereby say like it's somehow understandable. This entity is somehow something we can truly comprehend. You are presupposing that we would be able to comprehend it, and I don't think we can comprehend it, let alone tell how likelihood or the likelihood of it existing is. That's an issue. And the real issue here is that you presented it as though it was very scientific. It's not peer reviewed. Um, and I can't see any other physicist talking to it. And a physicist is not the one qualified to do this work. The people that are qualified to do this work are cosmologists and astrophysicists. These are the people you would look towards. And the more I look at it, I don't see him having any of those specific credentials. He is not the kind of person qualified. It's like if Richard Dawkins were to try and tell you about the existence of the universe. He could definitely be right, and he can know what he's talking about. That's not to say that's not to commit an automatic genetic fallacy, but it's more so that he just does not have the credentials. And the fact that nobody else has looked at it, people a part of relevant fields have yet to look at it, kind of shows that you have a very dubious form of evidence. The other thing I'd say is that, in response to you saying that believing everything formed from nothing, being nonsensical, is weird. You would have to believe in something that's beyond the concept of existence. This would be something that transcends the idea of existence. Like, that's even crazier. And if nothing else, they are equivocally crazy. They are equivocally mind blowing. But the fact of the matter is, one of them is substantiated. An independent model of the universe is more substantiated than a model where a God exists, because that is just not something you could even quantify or measure or prove. And not even the evidence you've cited proves it, because it's not done by a cosmologist or astrophysicist, or neither of the two in tandem. Um, and you said that religious scientists are a thing. That's definitely a good point. I see where you're coming from, but the issue with religious scientists being a thing is that they're vastly outweighed by the amount of people that are scientists and don't subscribe to religious views. Of course, not to commit like a bandwagon fallacy or anything like that, or even to appeal to authority. But through the research that we've done, and even the research, the types of research that you've tried to um, you see that they all subscribe to very specific types of presuppositions. And those would be of like the scientific method, those would be of empiricism. And just empirically speaking, we don't have anything to prove God. And again, the evidence you cited is not done by a cosmologist, an astrophysicist, or anyone a part of those fields. And it's not peer reviewed. Again, just I want to finish with the point. It being an entity that does not abide by logic, therefore justifies your argument, is a little weird. Because your original point was that it's crazy to believe that the universe formed from nothing, which you would want to believe that this entity has somehow transcended the idea of existence, just predates the concept of everything. And not just that, but it has infinite power. I think that's way more mind blowing. And again, I'll concede this much. And this is the only amount I'll be willing to concede. They're equivocally crazy. But again, the research that you've tried to use, which would be, science, um, that is more so willing to purport that an independent universe model works, rather than a deity that is omnipotent. That is a very fringe minority in the scientific community. But yeah, I didn't go over 6 minutes, did I?
No, you didn't actually, surprisingly. So yeah.
Okay. How long was that?
I think that was only like 4 minutes.
Okay. Okay. Cool.
So, Ari, you can go ahead.
Yeah, sorry, I didn't realize I was muted. Fuck. Okay. So you're done, right?
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Okay.
If you want to
Alright.
just go through questions or something, you definitely can. You're free to, dude.
No, I'm okay.
Uh-huh.
In regard to the calculation, we're trying to figure out how likely God is. So again, Unwin is trying to figure out how likely God is, but it does make sense. It does make sense because God's existence in itself isn't necessarily being measured. It's being measured in correlation with him not existing. So it's weighing the two out. It's comparing them. It's contrasting them. So discrediting, the other thing is that, again, discrediting him from simply being a physicist is fallacious. Like, nothing dictates that an astrophysicist or a cosmologist are the only types of people that can make this sort of calculation. If you're going to discredit him because of his authority being, well, in your opinion, false, or his authority not being capable of this type of calculation, then that, again, is fallacious. There probably is a name for the fallacy that I'm just unable to recall at the moment, but yeah, that is fallacious.
Yeah, appeal to authority, but yeah, I know what you're getting at.
Yeah, just an appeal to authority, not an appeal to false authority, because that would imply that he's undeniably false. The other thing is that the calculation supports that, and it supports what he's claiming, which is what I meant by that. So they might not be. So your argument is that they're equivocally mind blowing, and that's fine, but the universe is not physically able to be formed from nothing, and science goes off the idea of things being rationally proven, but its basis for God being disproven, or God just not existing in general, is fucking ludicrous, because it's basically the idea that everything formed from nothing, despite being a rational stance on something. But religion doesn't have this barrier. There's no means. The God in general, God's existence in general, isn't meant to be logical. Missing out, meant to be illogical.
Wait, are
Hey,
you
is
lagging?
anyone speaking, or did I cut out? Oh,
Yeah,
okay.
no, yeah, you stopped
Hey,
speaking
that's
to me
a.
too. No, sorry, you
Could you
lagged
go
out.
over that last about 40 or 40 seconds to a minute? You cut out after you said that he basically transcends logic. That's where you cut out.
Oh, did I cut out? Fuck.
Yeah.
Okay. Transcends logic. Did you hear the rational point I made?
No, I don't think so.
Okay. I'll go back into that. So the calculation supports the idea that God. The calculation just supports the idea that Unwin is trying to present, which is that there's a bigger chance of God existing. Not necessarily, again, measuring God himself. He's just claiming that the calculation would support that. Now, the other thing is that they might not be equivocally. Pardon me. You think they're equivocally mind blowing, and that's fine. But you have to acknowledge that the universe simply cannot be physically able to form from nothing. Period. And that's essentially because science goes off the idea that things are rationally proven, but the idea that the universe would form from nothing is a jump in itself. It is irrational. It's illogical. And their basis for God being disproven is an illogical basis. It's irrational. It doesn't make sense. You could justify it, but at the end of the day, everything being formed from nothing is a step. It goes against, again, the literal law of conservation of mass. Pardon me, of matter and energy. Albeit it would actually tie into mass too, so I was right. But the point is, it doesn't make sense for that to be the basis of something that's meant to be rational, whereas religion doesn't have that barrier set. Religion isn't meant to be logical. Religion is meant to be an explanation. I'm not necessarily saying that God's existence doesn't make any fucking sense. But what I'm saying is that if the scientific explanation provided doesn't make any sense, to the point where God's existence makes more sense, then you have an issue with your own thesis. Pardon me, you have an issue with your own premise. There's a legitimate issue there. To claim, like, the other thing you mentioned was that you would argue that the being isn't God due to him simply being, just due to the idea of being ludicrous, due to being due to the idea or the presumption that that person isn't God. That's it, that the person isn't God, and that in itself is just, again, it's fallacious. Because there would be no means of proving or disproving that. To claim anything would be fallacious. I would say just leave that point be, just leave it off. I did have another point to make, but it doesn't actually tie into what you've said. It was just a point that I was going to go into. I think I didn't cut out when I started talking, Abe. I didn't cut out when I started talking about the physicist point, right?
No, that was towards the beginning, so pretty much done.
Yeah, no, we heard it.
Okay, good. Then yeah, no, I'm done then for now.
I'm a little confused on that last point. You were saying that I was saying something about God and how he couldn't be God. Like, could you clarify a little bit there before?
You said if somebody comes down,
Oh,
and
okay.
that person comes down and claims to be God, then they aren't God, or specifically that person kind of can't be God. But that's assuming that the person themselves has a creator. There are just too many assumptions to have been made there.
Okay. So hold on a second.
And if you would argue that is because it's a ludicrous claim, then that would be an argument for incredulity, which in itself is again a fallacy.
Well, it would be an argument from incredulity?
Yes.
No, I mean, what would?
Oh, the idea if you were to
the God descending hypothetical?
Essentially, if you were to hypothetically claim that it is simply ludicrous, that is that's the only basis. I didn't say that you committed that fallacy. Just hypothetically, if you were to argue that is the simple basis behind it, then it would be an argument for incredulity.
Oh, okay, I got you. Give me one moment.
So... I'll put myself on the CDB. Abe, how much time do we have left, by the way?
In the stream overall?
Infinite.
The thing is an hour.
It says an hour?
No. The thing should be an hour, right?
Yeah. I didn't really. It should show me how long we've been going actually on PC. Let me just check real quick.
You can check the stream.
Yes, I can.
So,
correct.
Abe, are you ready to time, or let me hold it?
Go back. We are about halfway. Yeah, we're about halfway. We've been here for 30 minutes, so yeah, so another 30.
That's fine.
Okay.
So are you ready?
You ready? Yeah, I'm ready.
Okay,
yeah.
Go ahead.
Okay, so just heading back to the unwin point. Here's the issue. Yeah, I understand that you're not trying to measure a trait or a characteristic of of God. That especially would be just incredibly impossible. But I still think it's spectacularly unfeasible to believe that you could in any way think that you could, determine the probability of a God. And so here's the reason why. To really say that you could determine it you would have to be able to say that we understand things outside the law of physics. You would have to say that we understand things beyond our understanding. That's literally what God is. And so it gets into like this, for example. Think of it as though you were like a two-dimensional character. If you try to look up at something that was third-dimensional, you could not fathom the extra dimensions. And so you run into an issue here, where you're trying to fathom something that we just simply are not capable of doing. And then again, he, at least as far as I could tell, he did it trying to use like a few different mathematical equations, a little more so physics theorems, but overall it was very math-based. That still was very heavily presuppositional. And as you said, it was morally predicated. Those are very big issues. The fact that subjective experience plays a role in the probability is very, very likely to prove that it is an issue. If my subjective experience somehow affects something that's supposed to be objective, then I don't know. The fact that they're somehow intertwined becomes an issue, because you, or at least not to fucking straw man here or anything, but as far as I've come to understand, you are asserting that God is likely. And that just, I don't know, that's just untenable. Moving on though, there's a run out of time. Unwin can't be discredited given his field of expertise. I can see that on some level. I can see that you can't flat out discredit him, but this is why he's to not be taken seriously. He could be right, but there's nothing backing that he's right other than his research, which again is not peer reviewed, and again is done by someone who's not a cosmologist. And the people you'd want working in tandem to try and rationalize, or not rationalize, but determine the likelihood of such an entity are all your world's best mathematicians and all your world's best cosmologists. Cosmologists, the people who literally study, like, the beginning of the universe. These are the people that you want to look towards. And he's a physicist. Physicists are not as good mathematicians as mathematicians. His math could very well be wrong. And the fact that it's not peer reviewed poses an issue. The fact that it's not peer reviewed and that nobody has talked about it shows that it's not even being scientifically considered. So unless you want to get into something conspiratorial about how people are intentionally just ignoring him, then I'd have to say the fact that he's not being given any traction and that no one like Lawrence Krauss has even decided to entertain his idea shows that he's just not really someone that's being taken seriously. He's not being taken seriously by people who are at least bare minimum as educated and who work very hard. He's not on the level of Lawrence Krauss, not that I would imagine. You are able to say that I'm committing a bit of an appeal to authority. I guess you could say that. But the difference here is you have leading researchers in different fields. And so the reason you have leading researchers is because leading researchers are the ones to do groundbreaking research. These are the people to bring different hypotheses, and these are the people who generally are the ones doing the most amount of work and having the most amount of peer-reviewed works. That is very important, especially in the fields of science. In a scientific field, if you aren't having your work peer-reviewed, your work is to not be taken seriously. Part of the scientific method is to go through a process where you try and disprove it. The fact that he hasn't tried to get it disproven through peer review shows that it's to not be taken seriously scientifically. And I just want to go back to the point about God being above logic. You're saying that the universe forming from nothing and then God just transcending logic as a whole makes sense. No, again, I think they're very much just both mind-blowing. But here's the issue. If you want to say that God transcends logic, then how would you even go about logically proving that he exists? You wouldn't be able to. That's just not a thing you can do. That's like saying, Aro, I want you to objectively prove morality. Or at least I hope you're understanding what I'm saying here. I'm presuming that just a quick second, like, or if you would respond, do you believe in like moral absolutism or no? Like, objective morality?
Objective morality to an extent.
We'll go with like, hold on, your views on literary standards, real quick. Subjective or objective?
Completely subjective.
Okay, so here's the thing. It's more so semblant of it's more so semblant of objective versus subjectivity. You are going to inherently have an issue. That's all it is. Okay, let's see this last point here. And I just wanted to say that if you're saying science is about rationally proving things and that our existence is fundamentally irrational, given the understanding we have of how the universe formed independently, yeah, the universe is a lot crazier than we think. For the longest time, people subscribed to the idea that the universe was very, it formed a very, it had uniformity. That's the word I'm looking for. And people believed it was very organized and very coordinated, and that it was a lot more clear cut than it really is. That's why quantum physics has really blown up as a field, because quantum physics is about how a lot of our understanding about how the uniformity of nature is simply just not as realistic as we thought it was. And quantum physics is basically just about looking into the anomalies and the things that defy the sheer amount of basic, not even basic physics fundamentals, but more so things that seemingly contradict a lot of things in standard physics. And so the reason that this is an important field is because you're often looking to explain these anomalies, and these anomalies are important because they very much so challenge a lot of the established ideas. And it's obviously a lot harder to say, Stephen, okay. Is this his website?
No, I was just sending it in the chat for my next argument.
Okay. Yeah, I was just going to say this. I'll end on this one too. Basically, yeah, you can say that it seems more rational, But saying that we don't have all the answers, therefore this thing that seems the easiest, just doesn't work. And I just want to go back to the Sagan standard. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and the evidence I'm seeing is not in any capacity extraordinary.
By
Again,
the
it's
way,
huh?
I'm just going to interject really quick to remind you that we've reached the 40-minute mark. So
Okay.
keep
Let
going.
me end with this last sentence. This is all I'm going to say here. Basically, you've provided a non-peer-reviewed paper that has not been properly thrown through the scientific method or through the scrutiny of other scientists, nor relevant scientists, and the evidence you've provided simply is just not extraordinary for the claim of something so magnificent and so grandiose. Whereas we have Lawrence Krauss and many other cosmologists, as well as the almost entire scientific consensus, agreeing with the independent model of the universe. So I'm done. I don't know if I went over. I apologize if I did.
You did not.
Okay.
Actually, you did, but not by much. So it was just to finish off your sentence. So you're good.
Okay.
All right, go ahead, on. No.
Okay. First of all, I just want to get something out of the way. You're seemingly misinterpreting the point as to what I was talking about in regard to what he was measuring, and it was that he's not measuring any characteristics of God. Again, it's just the probability in correlation to him not existing. That's it. Just the probability. He's not measuring God himself, because if that were the case, and again, we agreed on this, if that were the case, then it would be fucking retarded. But in this case, it's just him measuring the probability alongside feasible evidence that God does not exist. The website that I linked to may not have specified that because it's not technically his book, but that's the argument that's evidently being shown here. The other thing is that you wouldn't have to say that we understand things outside of the law of physics, and well, actually, no, I won't actually get into that point because that's irrelevant. But subjectivity doesn't affect it by a wide margin, by the way, in terms of the calculation. Subjectivity doesn't actually affect it by a wide margin, and I've specified that too, even though it's a major issue, and I've mentioned that, again, Rogerian argument, subjectivity is basically the only counterclaim to the calculation. It's not a proper counterclaim. It's there, but it's just, at the end of the day, you'll get a very similar result in terms of the calculation, other than what people believe in from other places. Because if somebody believes in murder being okay, then that person might be morally just in their own mind, but evidently so, they're not morally just in current society. If this calculation, Stephen Unwin is British, so if I apply that just to other, maybe not necessarily Commonwealth countries, but let's just say countries that are, I don't like the word, but maybe first world. I don't like specifying countries into first world and third worlds, but if we say that first world countries have the basic consensus that murder is not okay, then it isn't an argumentum ad populum, and it isn't a general kind of bandwagoning fallacy. It isn't a bandwagon fallacy in general if you just kind of assume that is okay simply because that is morally okay, and that is also something that is implemented by religion as well. Most religion generally says that murder is not okay, unless there's some sort of malicious opposition behind it or whatnot. There's always exceptions with things like that, but police officers have exceptions with that type of thing too. My point overall, though, because I don't want to gish gallop on that, is that the calculation is the same regardless of your morals. This is just between you and I, and the calculation is the same. The calculation is not objective, because the calculation being objective would mean that God has been proven, because the calculation is there. The calculation isn't objective. The calculation is up for grabs, which is why I mentioned at the beginning, multiple times now actually, that you can perceive it however you'd like. It's just, at the end of the day, the evidence is still kind of there. The other thing is that his research is, again, you said it's not necessarily backed by other things. It's backed by other ideals. In this case, the ideal, or the idea, just the overall premise here is that the scientific consensus is practically bullshit. It just doesn't work. Its basis is, again, irrational, and if its basis is irrational, it does not work because it's meant to be a logical way of explaining things. If it's logical, then it can't have an illogical basis. So that's that. The other thing is that You can't argue he's intentionally being ignored by other scientists or physicists. It's just, like there's no basis behind that. How do we know that he's not simply a very, very minor individual in society? Maybe he's nowhere near as popular as we'd like to say he is. I already mentioned that he's in the minority of physicists. And the other thing is that his math being right or wrong doesn't depend on his occupation. That would be an appeal to authority again. And you'll only have an issue of objectivity and subjectivity with his calc if that's what's being concentrated on as a major issue. The newsflash here is that it isn't. It doesn't affect the calculation if that's what you're reflecting on. So, in regard to the scientific method in this calculation, you really haven't provided any evidence. And I say really, but no, truthfully so. You have not provided any evidence as to it being scrutinized, or as to it having not been scrutinized or not having been a legitimate calculation. Just really kind of got into the moral point, which I've already mentioned. And arguing that it hasn't been scrutinized or gone through the scientific method because of a lack of proof that it has, or because you haven't seen the proof that it has, would actually be an argument from ignorance. Yeah, that's all I have to say for now. Abe, I didn't go over the 6-minute mark, did I?
No, you
Yeah.
didn't. You hit 4 minutes, 5 minutes. So.
All
On
right.
that last part, did you understand my point as though like the reason he wasn't scrutinized is because he was illegitimate?
He was
Just
illegitimate.
making-
Yeah, I understood that. The issue is it. Well, if you'd like me to go on.
Yeah, I was just asking, just a little clarification before.
Okay.
I go on.
Yeah. I understood your point though.
Okay. I'll go ahead and get into it. So, again, even when you're measuring a probability of such a deity, how would you do that? This is something that, again, exists with outside of the realm of just all human logic. Consequently, something like probability or anything that is statistical just simply wouldn't work. You could not do that because it exists without outside of that. It is something that completely exists outside the realm of logic. There is no way to quantify or prove that. And just, I forgot to counter this earlier. But going back to the God descending hypothetical, that's the closest thing you could get to us finding out that there's a God. But again, the issue with that is the possibility that a deity that could descend is potentially just another being's creation by nothing. There are so many variables in such a being coming down that it's almost as though, you can't trust it. Because again, that itself isn't perfect evidence. And just keep in mind, the overall point I'm illustrating here is that you can't measure the probability of something that is not able to be determined probabilistically. It is completely outside that realm, just definitionally. No matter if you go with the Spinozan updog definition, or if you go with your the Oxford Supply definition. And you said the subjectivity doesn't affect the calculation much, but the fact that there's a margin of error when accounting for subjective like differences is an issue. And you yourself admitted, and you said this verbatim, the calculation is an objective, and then you also said I could perceive it however I like. I get where you're coming from, and obviously your overall presumption is that it's a good form of evidence and that it's more likely than not. But here's the biggest issue. How would you be able to determine that? You don't have mathematicians looking at it. These are the people most skilled with math, and that's often why you'll see mathematicians working in tandem with different scientists. In fact, it's what Albert Einstein did. And then there's no scientific review. The only person that knows about it, seemingly, is just him in terms of the scientific community. It has gained zero traction. And if you were to say that it's just him being unpopular, why doesn't he try and submit it? Why doesn't he publicly contact Lawrence Krauss? Lawrence Krauss does debates. Lawrence Krauss is very open to doing debates. If the guy was, that sure of himself, he could debate Lawrence Krauss, a leading cosmologist. But he doesn't. And at best, you have a guy whose research simply has not been substantiated or even tested. It is something that relies on him being correct when nobody can say for sure whether it's correct. It's trying to measure something that is beyond logic. It is like you're trying to apply a mathematical principle in probability to something that exists outside the parameters of that.
Mm.
It doesn't make any sense, huh?
Yeah, are you done? Sorry.
Oh no, I was almost finished, and I was
Okay.
just gonna say that. I was gonna say that the fact that it's not peer reviewed is showing that there's no reason to believe it. You would have to believe it going in with the bias that it's substantiated because you think it's substantiated. It's relying on its own ideas and its own principles and its own values. And to dismiss any scientific consensus while trying to use a scientific process to prove God is to show that it just does not work. If he's not willing to go through the full process of being scrutinized, then perhaps the research just isn't meaningful. And that's all I have to say about that. And I just want to say something here. You can say that you could say that it's not scrutinized because it has no proof, right? More specifically, I wasn't saying that it can't be scrutinized because it has no proof. I'm just correcting something here. I don't know if you misinterpreted or I misinterpreted what you said. I wasn't saying that it can't be scrutinized because it's like illegitimate. I'm saying the fact that it's scrutinized proves that it can't even be legitimized. That's all I'm saying.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Sorry, but you kind of you went over time, but just by a little bit.
Okay, sorry.
You're good. Now, Aro, you're. What I'm noticing is that you're kind of making your points very short, presumably because you don't want to go over time. 6 minutes is actually a lot of time, so preferably just don't even think about the time when you're speaking, unless you're like going on a huge tangent. Then you probably should.
I legitimately have nothing to say too some of the time, but because
Okay, you're good.
I'm condensing most of the things I'm saying.
Okay, just making sure. Just say what you want to say. Don't try and restrict it. But yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. Over the 6 minute thing, I'm more so trying to not gish out, because evidently so I wouldn't want to claim this right off the bat. I didn't want to claim this right off the bat, but I was Trini. I'm going to be honest. You did kind of bombard me with a lot of claims right at the beginning, so it does make it kind of difficult to refute. It makes it difficult to refute multiple things when there are multiple claims being made, part of a main claim, like multiple subclaims being made.
Yo, can I respond to that really quickly?
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah, I was just gonna say that in Lincoln Douglas, I keep referring to that. I'm sorry, but the way you do it is you'd have 3 primary contentions, and then you'd have like different subpoints. And so all it is I just have a few subpoints. At least for me, it just shows up as 1, 2, 3, 4. I have about 6 points going on at the moment, and I just wrote them down. So that's like why I'm able to keep up with them. It'd probably help if you wrote them down. It'd be a little bit easier. That's the issue. Down to a few more points. I'll drop the God descending one if you want.
Yeah, the issue is some of the points just in general are quite weak. I'm not saying weak as in they're weak on your end of the argument. I'm saying that the arguments themselves are quite weak towards the topic as a whole. They're arguments that don't necessarily correlate with what we're saying in general. So the God descending point, I mean, it's fine, but at the end of the day, the God descending point is nowhere near as relevant as the kind of I guess the topic of whether or not the calculation by unknown was scrutinized. That would be more so relevant, especially currently, because that's what we're getting to. But yeah, I'll just go on to what I was saying. In terms of the calc, it would work though, and it kind of has, because evidently so the calculation was made using logic. And you said that illogical things cannot be gauged. So illogical are just things that cannot be gauged in general because we cannot fathom them. So God, right? But the issue with that is, with that logic, the universe's origins cannot be gauged, and the scientific consensus can't be used, because that in itself, A, cannot be fathomed properly because it is illogical, and B, again, just doesn't fall under what would be rational. It doesn't. It's essentially, I haven't made this analogy yet. I did intend on making it earlier, but it's like the pillars of a building. The pillars of some sort of building being made out of wood, but the building itself being made out of straight concrete, and it only having 4 pillars. If the basis is weak, but the arguments on top might be legitimately decent, at the end of the day, There's no means of arguing that point properly if it was formed off of nothing. And the other thing is that if you mean that I will just go into my final point in regard to the whole God coming down thing. If you mean that being, let's just call him pseudo God for now, but God when I mean to say that he is God. If we're saying that being was formed off of nothing, but we're assuming that being isn't God, then that's illogical and cannot be claimed. But if we are claiming that it is God, then we still can't really claim that. That's why I said it's just kind of a point that's iffy. It's just really something that can't be claimed. Because we don't know where that person came from. We don't know what it is. And as far as we are aware of God, God is an intangible. As far as we're aware, God can't be seen. Hasn't been seen by any human to date. So that would mean God is intangible or invisible or just out there, somewhere that we can't see, just out of reach. Now,
Okay.
if that's the if that's the case, then I really don't see how we could argue whether or not he's created from something or nothing if we can't even dictate whether or not this person or being is God. In regard to this, so that's just it for that point. But in regard to the subjectivity calculator, there really isn't a margin of error, though. You keep kind of bringing up the margin of error, which is something I initially brought up as a counterclaim. But the issue is that it's not an evidently major margin of error. It's something that still supports the overall premise. If the calculation in itself was flawed to the extent where it could be completely reversed just between, again, you and I right now, then I would agree and I wouldn't use it. But generally speaking, the calculation is still it's still applicable. And yeah, I don't go back on what I said too. You can perceive it however you'd like, but that doesn't necessarily mean you're right. You can perceive something wrong. Now, the calculation isn't trying to measure something beyond logic. It's trying to elaborate as to why God basically can't be disproven. That's basically what it's doing. That's why the comparison is being made with God being disproven. That's the comparison. So the fact that it's not peer reviewed is something you also said, again, which kind of leads into another argument from ignorance fallacy, because arguing that it hasn't been peer reviewed due to a lack of proof supporting that falls under that fallacy. I think you did genuinely misinterpret what I said in regard to scrutiny and the calculation. I'm hoping you kind of understood what I meant, Abe. But what I meant was that you said it wasn't peer reviewed or scrutinized, and my point was that you can't claim that it wasn't simply because it hasn't been shown to have been. I didn't say that it wasn't because it was an illegitimate source or because it was an illegitimate calculation.
Yeah, I understood that. But
Yeah.
what I'm going to remind both of you is that we are coming towards the end. We are at the 50-minute mark. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you closing statements. So actually, I kind of want to extend closing statements longer than what I've been giving. If that's okay. Well, actually, you don't really need that much more time. So
I had like one more sentence left.
Go
for it, buddy.
Go for
Wait,
it.
what? Yeah, I just had one more sentence left.
And you still got time.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, that was so overall. That's just assuming that he isn't going through the full process with no legitimate basis behind that. The last sentence I just wanted to give is that if you actually go onto his website, which I linked, this is going to be longer than a sentence, but not by much. If you go onto the sentence that he linked, the website that I linked, and you look at the paragraphs, you look at the books that he's released. This is actually the main one, The Probability of God, a simple calculation that proves the ultimate truth. Like it's been recognized by multiple different people, like other authors. So Paul Davies, Templeton Prize winner and author of the Mind of God and the Cosmic Blueprint. Notices of the American Mathematical Society, Chicago Sun-Times, inquirers from Philadelphia, just overall different people. Other authors, like it's an established book and it's a legitimate source. If you don't think it is, then again, I can't do much about shifting your belief as to that. But at the end of the day, it is a source, and you can't discredit him if he doesn't fall under the credentials that you would want him to with his calculation. That's all I have to say.
okay. So now we're doing closing statements. So
Okay.
you each get 6 minutes to your closing statement. Since Aro had the last argument previously, I'm going to give Trini his closing statement first. Unless you wouldn't want that, or what?
Yeah, I'm cool with it.
All right, so you can go first. This is kind of your conclusion, so you can refute what he said if you want, but more so kind of conclude what you're saying.
No, I get you. So I want to emphasize one more thing. you said the calc works because it's made using logic, and then you also added that I said illogical things cannot be gauged. That is true. You then furthered with the universe's origins are not something to be logically tested. That isn't inherently true. Whether we can logically say anything about the universe prior to it being the universe is up for grabs. No one's entirely sure, but that's like the work of cosmologists to try and figure out more about that. No one's entirely sure. The reason I say that God's existence is something that is just not dependent or contingent on logic is simply because of the omnipotence paradox. The only way you could reconcile it is to say God doesn't abide by logic. And that would just make the most amount of sense. That's the only way you could reconcile that. And so given that, he's the one, this entity is the one that is not able to be logically tested. Continuing, I was actually I felt it was a little unclear. What was your pillar analogy meant to say? I was a little.
The pillars were meant to symbolize a basis for something. So even if the top is made out of concrete, the wooden pillars wouldn't be able to sustain that.
Okay, but were you analogizing? Like, are you saying like the scientific consensus is like foundationally wrong?
Yeah, the scientific consensus is wrong. Yeah.
Okay. So the issue with with saying it's foundationally wrong is that he himself is not doing anything to say that they are foundationally incorrect. He has done nothing outside of bring a point of contention. To say that they are completely incorrect is to find a way to be able to just basically debunk everyone. He has not done so. And I'll get back to that in a moment. But you said the margin of error is tiny, and because the margin of error is so just minuscule due to subjectivity, it's really to not even be considered. Two issues. Firstly, the fact that there's a margin of error about something objective given subjectivity is an issue. You run into the issue of basically having a margin of error when you're supposed to be certain of something. This is something that you need to be ridiculously certain about. But this ties into the second part of the argument. So again, you're trying to probabilistically determine something that exists without any boundaries, whether it be probability or mathematical or anything like that. It just is not something that abides by them. It is not something you could ever try and apply those principles to. That's just fundamentally something it is not able to do. So even just methodologically and philosophically, it just does not work. And you said that lack of scrutiny is a presumption. I don't know. I guess on some level it is. I can't definitively prove that to you, but then you would have to prove I can't prove the negative. I would have to see that there is legitimate scrutiny. But I may have miscommunicated this. The scrutiny I'm looking for is cosmological, mathematical, and just pure scientific scrutiny. And you need peer-reviewed research because that is what you look for when you read a scientific article. It's the same reason why when you when you hear a claim about like collision theory versus the Big Bang, that's why you need peer-reviewed research. Let's say, for example, that the Big Bang model is incorrect and that the collision theory is the accurate one. Just as a hypothetical. The collision theory does not have enough evidence at the moment. There's not enough peer-reviewed research. My entire position is that you could not justify a belief. I didn't say forever, but at this point in time, you cannot justify a belief in God. Not to my knowledge. And in this case, there is nothing that could justify it. With the lack of scrutiny there, the lack of peer-reviewed scrutiny, there's no way to say whether his work should even be legitimized. It hasn't been legitimized. It's been recognized by some people. The one that I'd say is, kind of interesting is by Hement Mehta, I think her name is. And it was a notice of the American Mathematical Society. But again, this is not who you would look towards. You would look towards cosmologists in tandem with mathematicians. And the reason you'd want that is mathematicians are generally better at math. And they help create models of different cosmological structures. You'd want a proper apparatus. But that's all I have to say. Before I completely finish, I just want to say thank you for the debate. Thank you for being cordial. And I think it's been an interesting discussion, and I hope everyone had fun. You are
Okay. Or you can go ahead
Okay.
with your
Uh,
closing statement.
How long is the closing statement?
You get 6 minutes. Trini just used 5 of it, 6. So
Okay.
Yeah.
Then I'll just kind of wrap up what he said and then quickly just finish off. Okay. So the issue with just in general, the issue that I'm kind of seeing with you is that you're relating what he's saying in his calculation and what he's saying with his logic behind his calculation to what you want him to say in a sense. So the issue is that he isn't the one debating this point, and his calculation is something I'm using to substantiate my own premise. It isn't necessarily dependent on, like, his words that aren't necessarily dependent on mine, but mine in a sense are on his. The other thing is that something else you mentioned is that the calculation is again objective, or that it should be objective, and in that case it's wrong because it isn't objective. The calculation is not an objective way of dictating anything because it substantiates that God cannot be disproven based on morals, which again, morals are, it's a touchy subject, but it's just something that at the moment people can't really argue definitively unless you're in, again, I don't like using this term, but first world countries where there are laws implemented. The other thing is that the lack of scrutiny is a presumption, and truthfully, so I wouldn't have any need to cosmologically prove anything in regard to scientific theories and the scientific theory and its calculations, because the claim, even if a negative one, was still made by you, and the claim itself is an argument from ignorance, because the claim is the claim itself is that there's a lack of scrutiny. Just the fact that the fact that there is a belief that there is a lack of scrutiny itself is an argument from ignorance. Now, more so, another argument from ignorance. Pardon me, that wouldn't be an argument. That's the only argument of ignorance. Argument from ignorance. The other one is the appeal to authority. Again, it's the third time you've committed said fallacy, and it's that it's attempting to discredit him by arguing that his math is just incapable, or that his math skills are not at the level of which somebody that just anybody in cosmo. I'm sorry. Yo, basically the point. Yeah, my throat literally kills right now because I've been talking so much. And from the call earlier, but more so, last thing I was gonna say is that discrediting him because of his credentials is simply fallacious, and the belief in total is entirely justifiable. Ex nihilo is an okay argument to have. I, I think it's absolutely moronic. And I don't think you're moronic for believing in it or moronic for arguing it, but I think the argument itself is moronic because I don't think it's substantiated at all. I think it takes too many leaps and bounds for something that's meant to have a basis of rational appeal in a sense. And I think Unwin has a legitimate calculation. I think the calculation is legitimate. I don't think it's objective again, but I do think that it is something that should be taken into account. Whether or not he is relevant in the science world, it doesn't affect me because I don't think him being relevant, and truthfully so, him being relevant to others doesn't dictate whether or not his calculation should be taken into account. You know, his calculate like if we're talking this is an example I've actually used. Well, I've used this example God knows how many times, but if we have a totalitarian state where 40 million people acknowledge that, let's just say acknowledge that killing Jewish people is okay. Y'all know where I'm going with this. Killing Jewish people is okay, but one person disagrees, and this one person is unknown, but this one person believes in that, and this one person gives a legitimate argument as to why it's wrong, but isn't acknowledged simply due to being a minority, then that doesn't discredit the minority. Even if the person isn't in any position, if the person's a fucking peasant, it doesn't discredit them. It doesn't matter if they had any education or not. They're still a person, and that is all I have to say.
Okay. I'd like to thank both participants for debating. You both gave interesting points. I'm not a judge anyway. But personally, I have no idea who won yet. I have to think about it. There's really no winner, considering that there's no person who conceded it. I guess it'll be based on who has the best
we're gonna
argument.
get participation prizes.
Yeah, at least you tried.
Yeah,
But
that stutter at the end. Yeah, my throat is killing me because of the last call, though. Damn.
yeah, you drink all your water?
Yeah, all of them.
I like how Abraham's like a concerned father. Oh, did you drink all your water? Jeez, dude. Oh, that's sweet.
Satire is not letting him daddy her around anymore.
Fucking nigga. Anyway.
She's fucking with Sully now.
Oh god. Okay. Anyway, yeah, this stream is
Sully
getting
and Guy
privated
gang
now.
banging
Yeah,
Satire.
this stream is getting privated now,
Oh,
nigga.
God.
Okay, yeah, this
Alright,
shit's getting privated, kid. But no,
Yeah,
yeah,
wait, but
I like
don't end the stream just yet. I
Wait,
have
let
yeah.
Coke have
Go
a
ahead.
conclusion. Actually, let
Oh, yeah,
let
Coke.
end this.
Is Coke here?
Yeah,
Okay,
Yes.
what's up, Coke?
Coke was
Coke
listening
is
to this
here.
in the shower.
Coke is here.
Anyway,
What do
I'm
you
okay
have
with
to
that,
say for you? Okay, what do you have to say for yourself, Cole?
I
What do
want
you
to
have to
die.
say for yourself?
I want to die.
Same.
I
And
want to
that.
die.
He is rubbing his naked body. I love peer-reviewed research.
Duh. Anyway, yeah, this is the end. So, see you niggas.
Wait, hold on. Wait, before you end it, are you willing to revisit this topic at a later date? Just hypothetically.
Sure, if there's any reason to, yeah.
And just for fun, I think it was a pretty good talk, actually.
All right. So yeah, see y'all.
Okay.
Be-
Bye.